All right, welcome back to the New CEO podcast. We are diving into part 2 of Feeling Your Way to the Top episode. If you listen to part 1, you'll know it's not like that kind of feeling your way to the top. So get your mind out of the gutter. I'm pleased to introduce my friend and co-host, Bindi Belanger, who's along with me for this wild ride.
Over here giggling because the title is hilarious. I'm like, I love the title, but you're definitely going to throw some people off when they listen and find that we're actually talking about emotional intelligence and not groping.
Yeah, you're not going to go very far if you thought it was the latter. Sorry.
Right.
It's not that kind of podcast. All right, so we're talking about emotional intelligence. We're talking about how, in order to be a successful modern mindful leader, you have to be emotionally intelligent these days. So, like, based on what we were talking about earlier, Bindi, were you ever told that you needed to kind of like stuff, quiet, or not feel your feelings in a work context?
I will say no, not explicitly. I was never told that myself, but I think it's because I learned that when I was in school. So I went to undergrad at USC and was in their undergraduate business program. So in taking those classes and hearing my professors and doing case studies and just watching the news or watching movies, right? There was this ongoing message of emotional women in the workplace were, looked down upon. It was unprofessional. It was a sign of a immature leader to show any kind of emotion at work. And so I think I was getting that messaging as I was, still young. So when I entered the workplace, I think I went in knowing don't show your emotions. And I think I even judged other women who showed their emotions. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe you're crying at work. And because it was ingrained in me, right? Like I was conditioned to believe that was not okay. And so I also think that I personally am less emotionally expressive than some. So I just want to be really clear. We are all emotional, but some of us express that emotion differently. I express it maybe more by myself or with very close friends. Some people are very outwardly expressive of their emotions. You're like, hey,
like your Cuban friend over here.
Right? Yeah. So I was never told that because I think A, it was conditioned in me that it wasn't okay, and B, that's just not my personality style. But I will tell you, there were definitely moments where I did get emotional at work, and then I had to find a way to, go release that somewhere, whether I went up to the roof and like mini screamed or had to take a walk around the block. So that's not to say I didn't get emotional. I just was never told to my face, like, stop being emotional. How about you?
It was never told to my face. I remember, speaking of being Cuban, I remember hearing early in my career, well, you know how Latina women are, at work. Like, you know how Latina women are, like they fly off the handle at work all the time. And so I remember hearing that being like, oh, do I do that? Do I need to be careful of that? Do people think I do that? So it was specific to being Latina as like a warning sign. And the person who said it didn't know, again, like as we talk about race and gender and things like that. My mom is Cuban, my dad American of Russian Jewish descent, proud Cuban over here. And I could pass for white. And so I was privy to some of these comments sometimes where people would be saying things about Latinos, about Latina women specifically, and I would hear it and be like, oh, they don't know. And so it was almost like earlier in my career, this, warning or something. It took me a while to actually be able to have the tools too, to be able to breathe and to process. And there were plenty of times where, I was in the bathroom just doing everything I could to try to like deal with the emotions because I didn't want to be the girl who was crying at work. Early in my career, there were times that like I just kind of had to like get out of there quickly before it felt like I knew it was coming up sort of thing.
Yeah, it's a really difficult situation to figure out how to manage your emotions at work when we don't have any role models at work showing what it looks like to, you know, thoughtfully, and the word that I want to say is productively, but that doesn't feel right. It, in a way, I guess what I'm trying to say is I've seen leaders either at town halls or in smaller meetings share their emotional state, right? Where they're sharing a personal story, or they're sharing, fears about what's happening in the marketplace, and they get emotional. And every single time there's a huge outreach from the company, from the employees, that are just like, oh my God, it was so good to see that this person had feelings too. Or, I was feeling scared, and it was reassuring to know that I wasn't the only one, and that, leaders can be scared too. Or this person, shared a personal story about their family, and they got emotional, and that made me remember that they're actually a human being, that they're not this robot leader. And so
Yeah.
every time I've seen someone in a setting where they were able to be somewhat emotionally expressive, obviously not to an extreme, but
Intentional about it.
that's
Like,
the word I was looking for. Very
yes.
intentional, but still authentic, right? That they were able to authentically share their emotions, that there was so much like connection that happened afterwards, that it was a reminder that everybody's craving this. We want this from our leaders. We don't want robots. We want humans. We want people that we know go through the same ups and downs that we do. And granted, leaders should be able to steer the ship in a confident manner and, have things under control, but we also need to be able to see that they're human.
Absolutely. I want to come back to this and kind of talk about like, okay, so then how do we help leaders um, get to the point where they are sharing authentically, and their intentions for sharing are authentic? But I want to kind of go back, take a few steps back and think about like, okay, so then how do you need to process so that you can get to a place where you can share, where you can be intentional about it and share authentically without letting the emotion completely take over? I think there's a processing step that needs to happen.
For
Do you
sure.
agree?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So how does one normally process their emotions?
And I think that's, in an earlier episode, we talked about self-awareness. That's so important because, for example, I'll use myself. I know that I'm not very emotionally expressive, especially not in groups. So if I know that about myself, trying to pretend that I'm going to be in a large meeting or in front of, my team, that would be inauthentic, right? To show up and then, try to wear my heart on my sleeve, when that's just not who I am in day-to-day life. So like, what is authentic to me? Authenticity for me in terms of sharing my emotions is one-on-one, or in a smaller group of people where, it's not like broadcast. So
Mm-hmm.
understanding for myself what that looks like, and then having some education on what emotional intelligence is and what it looks like. And I think having examples to look to and say, so and so was able to share their emotions this way, and then you have another person that maybe is much more emotionally expressive that does it this way, and there's all these examples in between. Because I think in this case, having a role model is helpful for me to say, oh, that feels comfortable for me, I could do this, but over here that's too much, or maybe I'm not ready for that just yet, or that doesn't feel like the right fit for me or for my company. And figuring out what that looks like, because I think without having an example or role models, it's really hard to just envision, like, am I going to cry in front of them like I would maybe my husband or my best friend? Like, do people do that? And so we don't really have a good measurement, right? So to
Yeah.
have a few examples of whether it's a YouTube recording of someone's talk, or a an anecdote that someone shared with you from their company, starting to collect these examples of what leadership with some emotional intelligence looks like, then I think we can start to connect with that ourselves.
Absolutely. I think it's a muscle too that you can build and grow over time. And just like any other muscle in our body, right? You can really start to define it the more you use it. So one of the things I love about this partnership with me and you is that we're so opposite. Like, I think if we were looking at an introversion extroversion scale, like you would be over here on the introversion scale and I would be over here on the extroversion scale. So for me, it's really about like reeling it in terms of the expressiveness and the emotion and the constant, I think that earlier in my career, there was oversharing, there was public processing of emotion. I've become a little bit more introverted as I've gotten older, as I've matured, hopefully, and as I've grown in my career, and as I've seen what's effective and what helps me create the results that I'm trying to create and what doesn't. And I think that earlier in my career, when I didn't have as many tools and when I was kind of left to my own devices to figure out what worked and what didn't, it's almost like a puppy in a puppy that's seeing people for the first time. I have a golden retriever, Bowie, who's in every picture I post, who I'm obsessed with. When Bowie was a puppy, she would get so excited with all the people around her. She just wanted to talk to everyone and visit with everyone. And I think that hope I had a little bit more intelligence, like a little bit more emotional intelligence than a golden retriever puppy. But like, I think back to some of my mistakes that I've made early in my career, and I'm like, oh God, that was so embarrassing. And so my inclination was way over here, where as I've gotten older and matured and have grown in my career, I have had to really like reel it in, figure out, and this is where mindfulness tools come in so strong, is because they actually have like the ability to breathe, the ability to process, knowing that I've needed to go for a mindful walk or go sit in my car and scream or whatever that is. Then I'm able to, it just gives my brain more time, even if it's in the moment, even if it's just taking a breath before I respond instead of immediately reacting. That has allowed me to get better results. So,
Absolutely. And I think you also kind of touched on another point, which is testing the waters of your role and your company. And I think culture is a huge factor in this, right? So if you work at a company that is very open, maybe lots of younger people where this emotional intelligence is highly valued and everybody's very expressive, there's a lot more safety in a place like that versus an older company with pretty well established traditions, and maybe the culture doesn't or hasn't in the past recognized or supported emotional expressiveness. In those cases, in the latter case, you'd want to tread a little bit more carefully and kind of test the waters and put a toe in and say, okay, I'm going to share a little bit and then maybe share a little bit more and kind of see where that line is for you. So I think it's a combination of your personal preferences and what the company supports. And if you enjoy being really emotionally expressive and you're at a company that's very oppressive, then maybe that's not a good fit and you need to go
100%.
somewhere else, right?
Amen.
Because there's
Yeah.
going to be conflict at some point, right?
Yeah, it's a round peg in a square hole, right? Totally. I think too, it's looking at like what kind of results are you getting as you kind of test, like when you're a bit more expressive and you bring more of your whole self and you're a bit more vulnerable, you know, if the result that you're looking for is greater connection with your people and more loyalty, and then you feel closer and they start bringing more information to you and you have a better relationship with them, and that's what's happening, great. Then what you're doing is working, keep going. But if you're trying to, I don't know, just let's just say, for example, like get them to work harder and that's not getting you the result that you're looking for, then it's about looking at your strategies and your tactics and then seeing if it's getting you the results that you're looking for too. Part of it. Part of it is that also like the world is opening up, the world is changing, like more and more companies are wanting people to bring their whole selves to work. So like if you're not good at emotions or feelings or dealing with emotions, you got to work on that.
Okay, so I've got a question for you. What's the difference between expressing your feelings and being passionate about something? Because I feel like I've seen a number of leaders, both men and women, who will get really frustrated or angry and they'll express their emotions, but then and in a really negative way. But then
Yeah.
they'll write that off as, well, it's because I'm really passionate about this issue, or I'm really passionate about this project. Like, how do we look at that? Like, are they just expressing their feelings, or are they simply just passionate individuals?
I think, first of all, I think it's kind of a cop out that I'm just really passionate about this. Like, you can be passionate a lot about a lot of things, but clearly you don't have control over your expression of that. So, bullshit, first of all. And then, secondly, let's talk about passion, because there's two forms of passion. I actually wrote my doctoral dissertation on how passion contributes to performance in the workplace.
Wow.
So, I love talking about passion. Um, Passion, there's two forms of passion, right? There's harmonious passion and there's obsessive passion. So harmonious passion is when you are incredibly passionate about a subject. It becomes a core part of your identity. It is something that you do and it makes you feel good and you love it so much and you want to talk about it, and you often find a way to weave it into multiple areas of your life. But it's harmonious because it's something that you can kind of take or leave, right? You love it so much and you want it to be a part of your life, but if it doesn't happen or it's not around, you might be a little bit sad, but it's not the end of the world. So like, let's take for example somebody who's passionate about playing the guitar, right? You love it, you try to do it as often as possible. You might find yourself talking about guitar, taking guitar lessons. You might be at the beach, which has nothing to do with the guitar, but you wind up finding a guitarist or bringing your guitar to the beach, right? You really love it. You might even call yourself, I'm a guitarist, I'm a guitar player. You might not even be that good, but you identify with this act of playing the guitar. If you are obsessively passionate about it, on the other hand, you you do it, you identify with it, it's woven into a lot of areas of your life. But if you don't do it, if you don't engage in this, you somehow feel like something is wrong with you, or you feel negative about yourself. You see this a lot with exercise and with like marathon runners,
Mm.
where all of a sudden, if they are not able to go for a run, if they injure themselves and they can't run in marathons, then all of a sudden, who am I without this thing? Their identity then becomes adversely impacted because they're not able to engage in this passion. And so, in a work context, you have to think about, is this passion driving me to do good things, or
Mhm.
is it driving me to act in bad ways, like freaking out and yelling at people? So if someone were to say like, yeah, I'm sorry that I yelled, but I'm just really passionate about that, I would ask them to look at that passion and to look at what it was doing in their life, and if there were ways that they could create a healthier relationship with that.
I love that. And I think that that's where I think a lot of confusion ends up is there's this, hey, we want you to be more emotionally connected with people. And it's like, okay, cool. I'm going to share my emotions more. I'm very angry and I'm going to make sure everybody knows it. And it's like, no, that's not exactly what we were talking about.
No, it's about, so, and I didn't fully answer your question, like feelings versus passion, but like, passion is very specific. There can be a whole range of feelings, right? So what we're trying to do is not just to get people to express their feelings, but to be more emotionally intelligent about in their lives. And that requires processing. And this is where mindfulness really comes into play, because all of the emotional intelligence literature is really asking people to become aware of their feelings. So if you can name your feelings, like we talked about in the 5-minute video in the part one, if you can name your feelings, that's going to make you more emotionally intelligent, because then once you can name them for yourself, then you can communicate to others how you feel, and they can then better interact with you. it's also giving your brain a minute to process what's actually going on. Like if you look at a brain, right? So like information kind of comes up through the back of our brain stem and it goes through the center of our brain, which is our emotional center first. So we are all emotional beings all the time. We are constantly processing emotions. It takes, maybe it's a millisecond, but it takes longer for the information to get from the emotional center of our brain to the logical center of our brain. So like if we can actually breathe and engage in some of these mindfulness techniques, we give our brain a greater chance of being able to process information logically rather than processing it emotionally.
I love that. And I think that mindfulness is so key when it comes to emotions. Actually, we were talking earlier before we started the episode about the books that we love around this. And one of my favorites is called Feeling Wisdom by Rob Priest, which is working with emotions using Buddhist teachings and Western psychology. And I think it's a wonderful marriage of mindfulness and feelings and emotions that kind of brings that all together. But like you said, the first stop is always to pause and to become aware. And without that, we're just reacting. We're responding from this emotionally driven, non-logical center of our brain. And like you said, there's a little slight delay where the emotions come up and we react from that place instead of giving ourselves that pause to think about, well, how do I want to express my feelings? What's the most, productive or intentional way that I can share this feeling? Not necessarily always filtering it. Sometimes filtering is appropriate and sometimes it's not, but allowing yourself to be more thoughtful and intentional instead of just auto reacting, right? You don't want to be on this autopilot without any thought, kind of just blah, like letting your emotions come out there, especially in a business situation, right?
Totally. And I think you then give yourself the chance, like you were saying, to be more thoughtful, to be more intentional, but to also like do things a new way if you want to. So I'm not a neuropsychologist, but you know, the neural pathways that we have they run deep. The more that we act a certain way, the more that we behave a certain way, the more a neural pathway is carved out in our brain. And so if you're trying to learn and grow and do things in a new way, you want to give your brain the chance, that beat, for you to actually then think about it, be thoughtful and intentional, and like, how would I like to handle this? Do I want to handle this the way I've always done it? Or do you then give yourself the chance to do things a new way? And that's where change happens. And that's where growth happens. And that's where you're going to start to see those results in your life.
Right. And then start carving new neural pathways with that
Totally.
pause and that choice.
Totally. So we talked earlier before we hopped on here together about the three ways that somebody processes emotions. What are
Right.
those?
Mind, body, and spirit. And so the way that I like to think of these three are: mind is intellectually understanding like the root cause of your feelings, how you choose to express your feelings, understanding your personal styles or preferences, personality types, and how that gets expressed. Then we have body, and really understanding that feelings are not only intellectual, but are actually stored within our body in various places and can cause us dis-ease if we don't attend to them. A great book on that is The Body Keeps the Score. We both got a copy. This is like one of the best books I've read on just understanding how we work. It focuses a lot on trauma, but I think that what's interesting to understand is that everybody has some level of trauma, whether it's mini traumas that happened because you had a generally really good life, but there's little things that happen that get stored in your body, all the way to really devastating traumas, which unfortunately, if you've experienced them, then a lot of this is going to hit very close to home. So that's the body's way of processing and storing emotions and feelings. And then spiritually, if we look at it from an energetic perspective, those emotions are stored as energy and can affect the way that we think and we move and we feel. And so when we look at addressing our emotions, we can do it from a mind, body, or spirit perspective. You could, from a mind perspective, seek out talk therapy. You could, talk with friends. You can do a lot of reading like I tend to do and try to understand where the root cause of your feelings are coming from, and where how they got to be what they are. From a body perspective, you can do things like exercise, you can do yoga, right? And then from a spirit or energy perspective, you can do things like Reiki or acupuncture to help clear the energy and release that. And I know
Breath work.
breath work is huge. I'm actually learning about that right now, and I can't wait to talk about it more. But one of your favorite ways, I think you've told me before, is called The Class by Taryn Toomey. And I would love to hear more about your experience, because I've only been once, but it was amazing. And I want to hear more about how you use the class.
Yeah. So I am so grateful to have found all of those different modalities over the course of my life. I was never an athlete per se, or at least I didn't identify as that. And so physical activity and linking that to emotional release was new to me as I've gotten older. And I think that I was always highly intellectual. I was always a student. I loved reading. I, thank goodness, got myself into therapy at a young age. Hallelujah. Praise therapy all day long. No shame in my game. But finding physical and spiritual, and we can talk about spiritual more too, because I'm a huge fan of energy healing and that work. But for me, a lot of the beauty of the class. So my friend Jordan gets a shout out on here. I was going to be in New York with some client work, and she told me, she's like, you got to go to the class. I was like, what is it? She's like, just go. And I went. It was a Monday morning. I had to catch a train out of Penn Station to go down to DC to meet a different client. So I had this beautiful little window where I could go, and I went on a Monday morning. It is the most beautiful studio you've ever seen in Tribeca. I had my suitcase with me and everything. I schlepped all my stuff down to Tribeca. Got there, it smells like Palo Santo. The floors are beautiful. There's, Kelly Wursler crystal lighting, and just the most gorgeous studio you've ever seen. And Taryn was teaching that day. And I went in, and it was, I didn't know what to expect. It was both incredibly physically challenging. So everything from jumping jacks to burpees to squats. But then she kept inviting students to put their hands on their chest and their belly, and to feel their body, and to thank their body, and to listen to their heartbeat. And she kept encouraging students to feel. And so that was different and new. It wasn't a yoga class necessarily, but it was also, but then there was some stretching and some of that. But then there was this opportunity she's like, okay, make these noises. Let there be a release from your body during this physical activity. You're moving energy around. So then the invitation to grunt, to scream. So you're in this class and people are just like, screaming. And it was liberating. So at first I'm kind of laughing, and then I'm joining in, and then I'm screaming. And then, and this was really unexpected, I started crying. And I was, you're in a class with 30 other people, downtown Manhattan, and I'm bawling in this class. And I didn't know why, but the only thing I could come up with was that we were moving so much energy around that was probably that I had stuffed. I'm a stuffer, that I had stuffed down into my body, that it needed to come out. And that was the day that it found its way out. And I am such a huge fan of the class. Like I now have her digital membership, so I do it in my house. I often shut the windows so that the neighbors aren't like, what the hell's going on over there?
Right.
But I love it. I love it. And it's because it's an incredible workout. I connect my body, mind, and spirit, and there's often a release. I have cried many a time in the class since.
That's amazing. And I want to really quickly share my experience because, we are so different. And I was actually talking with my coach the other day about the Myers-Briggs. She calls them stacks, and we'll have to get her on to talk about this. But the way that we process information and feeling and all that is very different depending on your Myers-Briggs type. But it made me realize, like, so when I went to the class, I'd heard about it for such a long time. I was a member at Wanderlust in Hollywood, which I think unfortunately closed as a result of,
Oh,
I
did
know,
it?
huge bummer. But
Yeah.
they had the class by Taryn Toomey, but it was always taught by, a variety of instructors. I would always see that on the schedule, and I never really understood, like, what is the class? And even in the description, it was too vague for me. So I would just stick to the yoga and, go for workshops and stuff. But one day, one of my fellow meditation teacher trainees mentioned it in our class, and she was like, when I started going to it, it changed my life. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to give this a try. So I show up at Wanderlust, and there is a massive line of people waiting to register for this class. And at Wanderlust Hollywood, they have this huge studio space. So they have a couple of smaller classrooms for regular yoga classes, but then they have, I can't remember what the name of the room is called, but it's massive. And they have workshops and big events in there. This place was packed. So I got there 10 or 15 minutes early thinking I'd have plenty of time to grab a spot and, like, get some water and just get settled in. When I walked in that room, there was almost no spaces available. So I went into being the introvert. I was like, let me find a little corner spot in the back. So I went and did that. But then I had enough space at that point, but there was still 10 minutes left. So people kept pouring in. And I think at one point there was probably 150 people in this room.
Oh my
And
God.
mats were inches away from each other, which made me feel very claustrophobic.
Claustrophobic.
Yes. But I thought, okay, I'm not going to run out of here. I'm going to sit through this class. I'm going to do this. So same experience, right? There's all sorts of exercises, from jumping jacks to squats to yoga poses, and the instructor's in the front with a microphone because it's this massive room. And then we get into the jumping and the screaming. And so I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to do this. So I start screaming, and I wasn't feeling it, right? But I did everything, and I screamed and I tried, and I wanted to have an experience because I'd heard so many people having an experience, and
Mhm.
it didn't happen for me. And so I have not been back, but here's the thing. I'm an introvert. So a class like that, not my favorite, right? I would much rather be in a 20-person yoga class with plenty of space in between. I go in, there's no screaming necessary, and then I go home. But I will tell you that in that very same room at Wanderlust in Hollywood, I've been to several tapping workshops. So tapping, also known as EFT or emotional freedom technique, is an exercise where you tap on the body's energy meridians while repeating a certain set of phrases in a certain framework. And through that, it's very similar to acupuncture in the meridians that you're tapping, but instead of
Mhm.
needles, you're using your fingertips to tap. When I did that, I had an experience similar to what you described with the class, where at first I was like, oh, this is fun. I was kind of laughing through it and didn't really know what emotional stuff I was going to uncover, but I, went and just for the experience of it. And then as I started doing it, all this stuff started coming out. And there's this point where she has you hold up a mirror and tell yourself, I love you. I was bawling, and I am
Oh
not a
yeah.
big crier, right? Just like I said, I'm not super emotionally expressive, so I don't cry all the time. But I was looking at myself in the mirror like, I love you. Like I was a hot mess, but it was so cathartic. And so for me, the class wasn't necessarily the the emotional release that did it for me, but tapping was. For you, the class might be exactly what you need and tapping might not be as effective. So
I'll probably cry in all of that. I'm like, no, I would cry in that, especially like the Louise Hay-esque, like looking yourself in the mirror and telling yourself, I love you, is, if you've never done that before, it's really powerful. And
it's so uncomfortable, but
oh my
so
gosh,
necessary. And I wish everybody did it. But so I wanted to share my experience because, I don't want someone to go to the class and think like, this didn't work for me. Depending on your personality type and your preferences and how emotionally expressive you are, different physical, mental, conversational therapies or exercises are going to work differently for you. So just know that.
Different strokes, different folks.
Exactly.
Cool. Well, this was a really good conversation.
I know. I feel like we could go into each of these topics at much greater length, but I would say that we could end on, a couple different things. One, emotional intelligence in the workplace is no longer a nice to have. It is a must have.
100%.
I think that we as leaders need to understand what our comforts and range will look like at work, depending on our personal preferences and the culture in which we work, right?
Yep.
And that there are so many ways of tapping into our emotions. And again, depending on your personal preference and some experimentation, it's really important to find an exercise or frameworks or treatments that work well for you.
Absolutely. We didn't get into a lot of the like energy healing and spiritual healing, but
I
maybe we'll
feel
save
like that
that
is
for
a
another
whole
one.
other episode.
Totally.
Yes.
Especially, yeah, it is. Okay, well, thank you guys for joining us today. If you like this, please feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please share this with your friends. Please let us know what part was most interesting or helpful. And we actually are offering a freebie as well. So if you would like to kind of better understand some of the emotions and what to call them and some of the names for them, we have a freebie available for you so that you can download with both our updated wheel of emotions as well as a really cool table to help you be more emotionally intelligent.
Perfect. And I hope you'll join us for our next episode, which is going to be a happy hour episode.
That's Cheers.
Right. So Natalie and I are going to grab some beverages and just help you get to know us better. And we're going to be talking about some things that you should definitely not do at work.
Please don't do this at work, please.
So we've reached out to our Instagram community and asked them to share with us some of their best, worst, most cringeworthy stories, and I can't wait to talk about that with you, Natalie, over a couple of drinks. So hopefully you'll join us for that.
We'll see you there. Thanks, guys.
Bye.